Welcome to the Corporate Venturing Insider Series, where I interview top practitioners in the CVC world and learn with you the best practices and golden nuggets that they have accumulated over their career. In this episode, we will be learning from Colin McLeod, professor at the University of Melbourne. Colin, could you take a few minutes to share your story and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. So when I left university, the jobs that people really aspired to tended to be either in banking, in consulting, or in large manufacturing companies like General Motors, BP, Ford. So I started my career at General Motors, and I worked there for close to 10 years. And towards the end of that 10 years, I'd started doing an MBA. And that was quite an interesting experience because all of a sudden I went from the world of General Motors to a world of a whole bunch of people had very different experiences to me. The old thing about you learn from both your teachers, but you also learn from your peers. And so I found out a lot about the world outside the company that I was working in. And then I got an opportunity to teach. The business school that I did my MBA at asked me if I'd do some teaching on a part-time basis. And I did that and I really enjoyed it. So I was then given the opportunity to become an academic. I did that for a couple of years. And then I decided, well, if I wanted to be an academic, I should do a PhD. And part of the way through that experience, I got the opportunity to work at Berkeley for a couple of years. I took a leave of absence from the University of Melbourne. I sort of worked at both universities because their semesters offset. And so I spent a bit of time in Silicon Valley during the internet boom of the 90s, which was quite an interesting time to be there. And also an interesting time to be doing a PhD in the commercialization of new technology. So a lot of the data that I collected was actually in Silicon Valley. Then I came back to Australia, left university life, worked for Goldman Sachs for a number of years, and then I worked in professional sport. So I worked for the Australian Football League. And then after I finished the AFL, I went back to academic life. So in 2012, I came back to the University of Melbourne. I've gotten a bit of the bug around new ventures and venturing in general. So I've had an involvement with probably about 15 new ventures, I guess. I mean a serious involvement, an investor, a director, a shareholder, not just give them a bit of advice from time to time. And now I run a centre at the University of Melbourne called the Melbourne Entrepreneurial Centre. So we run a traditional accelerator program, which most people would be very familiar with. But we also run a bunch of programs aimed at our research community. And as I mentioned, Australian researchers they're world class. Australia is one of the few countries in the world that has 7 universities ranked in the top 100 in the world, which will surprise a lot of people. We're a country of 25 million and we have 7 universities ranked in the top 100 in the world. We always talk about per capita. If we come to the Olympics, everyone talks about per capita gold medals. We look at per capita publications and patents and things like that. Australia puts out the equivalent of about 33 times our size in terms of inventive output. We're punching above our weight. We're generally ranked, Australia as a country is very good at inventing things. We're one of the most inventive countries in the world. Every day, people around the world use things that were invented in Australia. Wi-Fi was invented in Australia. Black box flight recorders, plastic lenses in glasses, cochlear ear implants. What we've never been very good at is commercialization. For example, our major export is still raw materials dug out of the ground, raw minerals and agricultural exports. People like the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the OECD, always rank us in the top, somewhere between the top 5 and 10 countries in the world. And that's in raw data, but we fall outside the top 50 in terms of outputs, in terms of commercialization and public impact. So a lot of my work is actually working with the research community and try to help them work out their own journey as a researcher. Do I want to continue to be an academic? Do I want to go with a spin out? Do I want to license my technology? And so a lot of the growth of what we do at the University of Melbourne, which is where my centre is located, is working with the research community and try to help them work out ways in which they can have an impact with their research that goes beyond the traditional measures of things like publishing. So that's about where I am today.
Thank you, Colin. I'm going to double click on a few things. I want to touch on your PhD, but more the content of your PhD, which was really about commercialization of innovation. And when we look at startups and looking at investing in startups, they always have really good ideas for value creation. That's why they're starting. They are going to create value for society, maybe for our planet. Value creation is never the problem. The value capture, on the other hand, is always a challenge. And I always think of this as a ratio. What's your value capture divided by your value creation? And I feel like your PhD really deep dive into this topic. So if you don't mind sharing some of the insights you got from that, but also how your thought process evolved over time in terms of commercialization of innovation.
I think like a lot of people, and I'm not sure it's changed all that much. I think a lot of people do have a bit of a sense of if I build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to my door. And as we see the data from companies like CB Insights, 50% of startups fail because they build a product nobody wants. I suspect that number hasn't changed, since I did my PhD back in the 90s. And so I think we do have this sort of shiny new object idea. If I build something, people will come and find it. And I think the point you raise about value, what is value and do we understand value? I was particularly focused on partnerships and how do people form partnerships and the idea, and you would know at a company like TDK couldn't do everything themselves. Someone had to manufacture it, someone had to invent it, someone had to distribute it, someone had to provide the warranty, someone had to provide the service. And so I think the issue of value capture is something that most founders don't understand very well. One of the things that you're trying to do, and you should never lose sight of, is you are trying to get people to change their behavior. And so this whole idea of we're trying to create enough value that'll motivate someone to behave differently in the future the way in which they have in the past, I think is a point that not enough founders really understand. I sit on the investment committee for one of the university's venture funds. And so typically we invest in deep tech, like seriously deep tech, things with very long, very challenging technical and scientific pathways ahead, very challenging regulatory pathways. So we talk to lots of other people who are involved in deep tech. But even they will tell you about 80% of the successful startups they see, their success is based on an insight into the market no one else has got, not an insight, not a technological insight.
So I'm going to ask you questions about the University Investment Fund, which I think is called Genesis Pre-Seed. But I want to double click on the two golden nuggets you shared. I think the first one is about partnership. You can't do everything alone. And it's interesting because TDK just changed our view of how we are going to deliver value to the world. And the way we describe it is to be the partner number one to our customers. So I think the partnership concept is really, really key. But the second one, and I like to think about it from the job to be done concept, what it is the customer is doing today, and you're trying to change the behavior for them to change, but the job to be done is the same. And that's why I want to double click, because you work with so many entrepreneurs, you've been active in 15 different ventures, raising capital. How do you apply that rigor on the value capture? This is really hard, so I want to know if you have some tips.
I think you've got to have something that no one else has, and it's usually knowledge. And it's usually knowledge about the customer that no one else has. The classic product market fit, is there a gap in the market? Is there an opportunity for me? And if you've got that, then you're probably going to get a bigger value capture than if you've only got marginal value for the customer.
Very nice. So I want to ask about what's specific to Australia. But before I do that, I think I'm going to take advantage. You lived in Silicon Valley and you went to Berkeley. How do you see the biggest difference when it's about entrepreneurial aspects between Australia and Silicon Valley? And clearly, Silicon Valley is unique even within the US. But here I'm looking at what are the striking differences between how you see things happening in Australia versus Silicon Valley.
In Silicon Valley, they've been doing this for 100 years. The famous story, the first great brand to come out of Stanford was effectively Hewlett Packard, and that was in the 1930s. So that was 90 years ago. So that's how long they've been doing it for. And so we can't forget that these effects are cumulative. There's also some legislative changes in the US, particularly around the right for inventors to get value out of their invention, particularly for academic inventors. There are sort of tax concessions and things like that. But I think the thing that sort of distinguishes Silicon Valley is everyone's involved in it. Like everyone's got a startup, everyone's connected to someone else. The places like Stanford and Berkeley are central to all those things. But the most important thing they get is good mentorship. People who have done it before. And I just think at a place like Silicon Valley, the number of high quality people who can give you advice, who can give you direction, who can support you. So I think this continual journey of learning is what often distinguishes great entrepreneurs from people with just a startup idea. But in a place like Silicon Valley, there's so many places, so many people you can learn from.
Yeah, you do have a very high talent density, people who've done it, but there's also this paying forward somehow where people are willing to give advice and spend time with no apparent benefit to them to help out. And I feel like in Australia, people are actually very open to be helpful and paying forward. So I feel like there is some ingredients in Australia that should also work out well in the future.
I think that's true. Certainly, as a university, we get a lot of help from our alumni, and we've got alumni all around the world now. So we started off as quite a small accelerator program that had four teams in it. This is in 2012. This year we'll have probably 500 people go through our programs. The one thing they are all willing to give, funnily enough, is time. And yet for many of them, it's their most precious resource. It's the one thing they would complain they don't have enough of. But I do think they do share a sense of recognizing this is a bit of a national imperative, so we all need to be doing it. And a couple of things have happened over the last few years. So as a university, we're very heavily focused. We're very strong in medtech. We're regarded as, people in Boston would say Melbourne is the second best medtech centre in the world. And so when you start looking at where we put our money as a university, it's around seriously deep science. To give you an example, anyone in the world who has had a COVID vaccination owes something to the University of Melbourne, because one of the research centres associated with the University of Melbourne, called the Doherty Institute, was the first place outside China to clone the coronavirus. And that's just an example of the level of inventiveness that we have, the level of high class research. But the venture capital community in Australia wasn't set up to service that type of research. Venture capital funds are tied to their investment period or their investment mandate. We're talking about technology or science that has a very long scientific pathway and a very long regulatory pathway. So when you say, I've got an idea, or I've got some lab results that would indicate that this is a potential pathway for a drug or for some other therapeutic, but it's going to be 15 years before there's even a product. That's not very attractive to venture capitalists. That was why the Genesis Fund was set up. So we're really in the business of helping people move from, I've got a piece of technology which I can take forward with proof of concept funding. I have to build a venture to house that technology. So I need a structure to put it in.
It's tough, especially you mentioned in Australia, many VCs invest in SaaS. And clearly, a while back, Atlassian was a big success, but recently Canva is a big success. You get returns on your capital much quicker, much earlier than if you invest in deep tech, where you need really patient capital. Do you think Australia is ready for this type of deep tech, 8, 10 years waiting time before you can return the fund?
I think it's getting more ready for it. And the reason I say that, if you looked at the large venture capital companies in Australia, they really started to grow quickly, probably about 5 years ago. And they started to grow when pension funds started to invest in them, what we call superannuation funds in Australia. And we're seeing these sorts of returns coming in. So, and very quickly by Australian standards. But I think we're starting to see the same thing with deep tech investment, but it'll take a while. It'll take a while. So we have another fund called Tin Alley Ventures. Tin Alley is a famous street at the University of Melbourne. Everyone knows Tin Alley. And Tin Alley Ventures is actually run by an external fund manager called Tanara Capital. And so one of the things that they did, they brought a guy back to Australia called Andy McLeod, who most people won't have heard of. But Andy used to be head of life science investment for Oxford Scientific Endeavours. OSC is one of the most successful life science investors in the world. And as you know, we talked before about partnerships in the venture capital world. Often your reputation is the most important thing you have. Now, not just your deal making and the size of your fund, but your reputation as a person and as a partner. And of course, when Andy comes back from Oxford, he brings all these Oxford connections with him as well. So we're now involved in conversations with venture funds, with international venture funds, and co-investing with people who had never really had much interest in Australia. And they're not making massive investments yet, but they're now part of a conversation that 2 or 3 years ago we weren't having. So it's evolution rather than revolution. The revolution's down the track.
Yeah, but you can see this could be the catalyst for more and more investments from outside Australia going into Australia. that would then bring mentorship, that would bring guidance and potential customers outside Australia. Actually, this is maybe one more difference between Silicon Valley and most of the world is there are so many angel investors in such a small space. And some of it comes not even from entrepreneurs who started a startup and became successful, but some even late employees joining, getting good stock options, getting money, and then being angel investors. How do you see the angel investment space in Melbourne and Australia? And do you think it's going to get like a bigger snowball over time?
I think it will. And I think at different times it has different dynamics. One of my close friends at the university did his PhD at Stanford under a guy called Bill Sharp. And Bill was the guy who really invented asset allocation across a portfolio. And
Mm.
so I think people are now saying, when we talk about asset allocation, where's the exposure to venture? Whereas 5 years ago, people never said that.
That's a good segue to talk about corporate VCs in Australia.
Yep.
How do you see corporate VCs first in Australia, and how do you see it changing over the last 5 years?
I think in Australia, the corporate VCs have probably had a bit of a lower profile than what they do. And once again, when you look at the numbers that come out of the US, the big corporate VCs are Google, Amazon, Apple. We had a guy, I won't mention his name, but he was in the Melbourne Accelerator program, traditional accelerator program, in about 2012, and the business he was in got sold off. His first investor was Google for $300 million, which at that stage was bigger than the entire venture capital industry in Australia. So I think in Australia, corporate VC has probably been, it works in unusual ways and probably not quite visible ways. So to give an example, one of the unicorns in Australia is a company called Aconex. And the two founders, one was a guy called Lee Jasper and the other guy was a guy called Rob Philpott. And they went through uni together and they worked at McKinsey together. And so the people at McKinsey invested in this idea. They thought, there's a smart young guys. They've really done a lot of work putting this together. We'll invest in it. But I think increasingly we're seeing that sort of model where people in high profile corporate roles are making direct investments. But I think what happened in Australia is a lot of corporates decided maybe they'll have a go at it first. So they started up, span off their own accelerator programs, venturing programs, and what have you. And I think a lot of them haven't worked out quite the way they hope they might. So they're going back and looking at maybe we need to become a VC of sorts. But I think that's probably the model that's going to become the most prominent in Australia.
Yeah, I was going to relate to your earlier comment at the beginning of our interview about Australia punching above their weight. And I was wondering why corporate VCs is not. But maybe one explanation you're giving is corporations like to try by themselves, in a way, punching above their weight, trying to get their innovative ideas off the ground versus trying to get it outside and maybe incorporating it in.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I suppose the other thing I'd say is that in one sense, dealing with as good ideas can come from anywhere. Even deep tech ideas can come from anywhere, but they're more likely when there's lots of them at a university. So that it's efficient to deal with a university. We realize we have to get better at it. But if you look at the universities that I know the ones in Victoria better, Monash, Melbourne, RMIT, they're all trying to learn the new world, if you like. And that's a new business for us. And as I say, we're still learning it. I think we had about, 10 spin outs this year, which for a university of our size is quite a lot. It's the most we've ever had. But we've also, across the various accelerator programs that I'm involved with, over their life, we've raised about $400 million in external funding. And that's not all academics. Most of that funding is through the traditional accelerator program. But all of a sudden, there's a bit of a vibe in the university that this sort of thing actually works. And we can see researchers who are actually developing technology that's having an impact in the world, not just scientifically. And we find some people really embrace it.
That is a golden nugget. So, with your view of the ecosystem of corporate VCs in Australia, which is growing, I think, but still maybe timid, how would you advise local entrepreneurs to engage with corporate VCs, raise money from them, and try to extract value from these corporate VCs, not just money, but value?
It's an interesting question because I've got to admit I don't think entrepreneurs in Australia really understand the challenge of finding money all that well. And so I'll include corporate VCs in that. So there's a sort of rule of thumb in Silicon Valley that you need to have about 100 meetings to get investment. And about 80 of those meetings are intelligence gathering. So I've done all my homework because I know that when I sit down with you, I want it to be with the right value proposition for you at the right time. And if I haven't done the homework that gets me to that, it's just really superficial. And I think the whole idea of saying talking to the right person, not just the right company, you've got to be in front of the right partner at the right time with the right value proposition. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking to corporate VCs or institutional VCs. I think it's the same story.
And it's amazing because I can receive a cold email where I can very quickly see the person has done the research. They
Yeah.
can quote one or two portfolio companies that are relevant but different. They can know about what we're doing. We have a website which I think is very unique in the VC ecosystem because if you go to our website, you can see all our deep explorations, the past deep exploration and the current one, and you can see which investment director is driving which deep exploration.
Mm.
It's really easy to find information. And so if in a cold email, there is not even a mention about our portfolio companies that's relevant or the deep exploration we're conducting, we know they haven't even checked the website carefully enough to be able to find that match. I really like your point, which is there is a level of research to make sure that when an introduction is made, it's at the right value proposition. So I want to end with a final question, and this is future looking. Let's imagine Melbourne 20 years from now is becoming the next Silicon Valley, okay? This kind of amazing future. And we try to backcast to today. What do you think are the missing pieces to get to that ideal state of the future? What it is that Melbourne is missing, but if we had, then we could get to that next Silicon Valley 20 years from now.
I think there's two things. One is we are part of a global community. And I think about the University of Melbourne and our alumni network. In the 6 years I've been in this job, I've never called an alumni and asked them for help and had anyone ever say no. I think the other thing is the other area is that a lot of things that we're trying to do, we talk about medtech, for example, because that's the strong area for my university. If we could find a new venture that had the potential to be a unicorn, our ability to find someone to run that company is low. And so I think, and I mentioned before about Andy McLeod coming back from Oxford Scientific Endeavours. Who's next Andy McLeod, and how do we all work together to bring them back to Australia? Where do we find these people? I think the third thing is that, particularly in academic environments, entrepreneurship will become better understood. And what I mean by that is, for most academics, entrepreneurship is not the pathway that they want to go down, nor should they go down. But I'm a great believer in you choose X in preference to Y, you don't choose X in ignorance of Y. So we've started running programs for our PhD students around entrepreneurship. And some of them, they say, well, now that I find out about it, that's not what I want to do. That's perfect. It's not what you want to do now. It may be what you want to do in the future when you've established your academic career and so on. So I think there's, sort of educating the scientific community, connecting better to the global community, finding the people who can lead these bold new companies, particularly around deep tech. And I think that to some degree, venture capital will always be an issue. But I think if you get the first three right, the venture capital will find you. And you'll start to see the big venture capital companies looking more at Australia.
I think what's interesting, and this is a great way to end the podcast, is it's all about the people. People
Always.
in terms of relationships, people in terms of getting the talent back, people in terms of education and awareness. It's like people cubed.
No, it's a really interesting idea, just the movement of people around an ecosystem, the reputation you have in that ecosystem and how it's everything. And I think getting people passionate about those sorts of things, passionate about the work they're doing, passionate about working with each other, then I think if you can make those things work, then everything else looks after itself.
People, mission, purpose. Colin, thank you so much for today. I think you shared quite a few golden nuggets, and I think the audience learned about what's specific about Australia, the potential of Australia, and the entrepreneurial spirit that has the potentials to get to the Silicon Valley 20 years from now. So thank you.
Yeah, look out, we're coming. Thank you very much, Nicholas.